Thursday, September 14th, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, United States. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto stared at the metal tray before him, his hands trembling slightly as steam rose from food he couldn't quite believe was real. Fresh bread, actual butter, sliced beef, boiled potatoes with salt, green beans that looked like they'd been picked that morning, and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt acorn substitute he'd choked down for the past year. The mess hall smelled like prosperity, like abundance, like everything his officers had told him America didn't possess. The scent of roasting meat mixed with fresh bread created an olfactory assault on beliefs he'd carried since basic training. Around him, 40 other Japanese prisoners sat in stunned silence, staring at their trays as if they contained weapons instead of food. "This has to be poisoned," muttered Private Kenji Sato beside him, his voice barely audible. But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, wide, hungry, disbelieving. Takeshi had spent 3 years in the Imperial Japanese Army. He'd fought on Guadalcanal. He'd survived Tarawa. He'd believed every word his commanders told him about the weak, decadent Americans who couldn't fight without their luxuries. The enemy that would crumble when faced with Japanese discipline and fighting spirit. The soft nation that needed chocolate and cigarettes just to march. He picked up the fork. The metal was solid, not the bent scrap they'd used in field camps. His hand shook as he brought a piece of beef to his mouth. The taste shattered something inside him. The lie they'd lived. Takeshi Yamamoto had been born in Kumamoto Prefecture in 1920, the second son of a rice farmer who'd served in the Great War. He joined the army in 1941, proud to serve the emperor, convinced of Japan's divine destiny to lead Asia. The training had been brutal. The food had been scarce even then. Rice and pickled vegetables, occasionally fish. Never enough, but the officers had explained it. Hardship forged warriors, luxury weakened men. Look at the Americans, they said, with their soft hands and their need for coffee. Look at how they complained about discomfort. The Japanese soldier was superior precisely because he could endure what the enemy could not. On Guadalcanal, Takeshi had seen American supply dumps, mountains of crates. The waste had astounded him. Half-eaten rations discarded, equipment abandoned. His unit had survived on whatever they could scavenge, supplemented by grass and tree bark when nothing else remained. They'd mocked the Americans even as they starved, weak, pampered, unable to function without abundance. The propaganda had been consistent. America was a nation of factory workers and farmers, led by Jews and manipulated by Roosevelt's lies. They had no warrior spirit, no discipline. Their soldiers were mercenaries fighting for pay, not honor. When faced with true warriors willing to die for their emperor, the Americans would break. Japan's industrial might would overcome. The statistics proved it, or so they'd been told. The reality was different. Japan produced approximately 7,000 military aircraft in 1943. America produced over 95,000. Japanese shipyards launched perhaps 600,000 tons of new vessels that year. American shipyards launched 8 million tons. One Liberty ship rolled off production lines every 42 hours. The entire Japanese merchant fleet could be replaced by 3 months of American production. Takeshi hadn't known these numbers. None of them had. They'd known only hunger, fatigue, and the certainty that spirit would triumph over material. Then came Saipan, the first shattering. The capture itself had been chaos. The last Banzai charge, the cave where he'd hidden for 3 days without water. The moment he'd stumbled out, hands raised, expecting a bullet or a bayonet. Instead, he'd received water, medical attention. Transport to a ship that looked larger than anything Japan had ever built. The voyage across the Pacific had taken 2 weeks. 2 weeks of regular meals, 2 weeks of medical care, 2 weeks of slowly realizing that nothing he'd been taught made sense anymore. The ship's crew had treated them with casual professionalism, not the savage brutality he'd expected. They'd been given bunks, blankets, 3 meals daily. But the real shock had come when the ship reached San Francisco. The harbor stretched for miles, dozens of ships, hundreds of ships, Liberty ships, Victory ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, more naval power in one location than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed. Cranes worked day and night, loading and unloading cargo. Trucks lined the docks in endless rows, each one newer and better maintained than anything he'd seen in the Japanese military. From the ship's deck, Takeshi had watched America work. The scale was incomprehensible. One dock worker had dropped a crate. He'd just dropped it, letting its contents spill across the concrete. Fresh oranges, dozens of them, rolling across the ground like worthless stones. Another worker had kicked them aside and kept working. Takeshi had eaten an orange exactly twice in his life. Both times it had been a gift marking special occasions. Here, they were treated like garbage. "Look at that," Private Hiroshi Tanaka had whispered beside him. "The waste, the abundance. How can we be winning this war?" No one had answered. The question was too dangerous. The train from California to Wisconsin had taken 4 days. 4 days of watching America roll past the windows, farms that stretched to the horizon, factories belching smoke from morning to night, small towns where every house had electricity, every street had cars, cities where buildings rose higher than temples. They'd been fed on the train, sandwiches, fruit, coffee, real coffee. Now, in the mess hall at Camp McCoy, that first meal sat before them like evidence in a trial. Breaking bread, breaking beliefs. Takeshi forced himself to eat slowly. The beef was tender, the bread was soft and warm, the butter melted on his tongue. Each bite contradicted 3 years of propaganda. Around the table, his fellow prisoners ate in silence. Some wept quietly. Others stared at their trays with expressions of confused shame. Sergeant Masao Kobayashi, who'd survived Burma and New Guinea, put down his fork and covered his face with his hands. "My wife writes that they have no rice," he said quietly. "The ration is 3 cups per week. 3 cups. And here, we have this." The words hung in the air. No one could meet anyone else's eyes. The meal lasted 30 minutes. 30 minutes that destroyed certainty. When the American guards told them to take their trays to the washing station, half the prisoners looked confused. They'd expected to lick them clean. Instead, food remained on several trays, leftovers that would be thrown away. Thrown away. Takeshi's unit on Guadalcanal had gone 4 days eating nothing but palm fronds and rainwater. Here, the Americans were discarding food. That first night, lying on a real mattress with clean sheets, Takeshi couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The room was too warm. His stomach, unused to so much food, cramped and churned. But more than physical discomfort, his mind churned with questions he'd never dared ask before. If America was weak, why did they have so much? If Japan was superior, why were his people starving while he, a prisoner, ate better than he had in 3 years? If spirit conquered material, why had every battle since Midway ended in Japanese retreat? The propaganda had answers. The Americans were spending everything on the war. Their economy would collapse. Their people would rebel. Victory was inevitable, but was it? The daily evidence. 3 days later, Takeshi learned about the camp routine. Morning formation at 6, breakfast at 7, work detail at 8, lunch at noon, afternoon activities, dinner at 5, lights out at 10. The work wasn't hard. Some prisoners maintained the campgrounds. Others worked in the kitchen. A few helped with construction projects. The labor was nothing compared to what they'd endured in the army. And the food kept coming. Breakfast on Monday, oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast, scrambled eggs, bacon, coffee, or tea. More food than Takeshi's family had eaten in a week back home. One morning, Private Sato asked the American guard how many prisoners the camp held. "About 3,000 here," the guard replied. "We got camps all over. Maybe 400,000 German and Italian POWs total. Japanese prisoners, you guys are more rare. Maybe 15,000, 20,000 total. 400,000 prisoners. All fed like this. All housed. All receiving medical care." Takeshi did the math. If each prisoner received 3 meals like this daily, the amount of food required was staggering. And this was just the prisoners. The guard had mentioned it casually. America was feeding its enemies better than Japan fed its soldiers. The guard had continued talking. "We got 10 million guys in uniform total. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. All gotta eat. Plus the workers in the factories. Rosie, the riveter types. They get good wages, good food. Gotta keep production up. 10 million soldiers. How many did Japan have? Maybe 5 million, and most of those were hungry, undersupplied, cut off on distant islands. By the end of the first week, Takeshi had learned more about American production capacity. The camp library had magazines, Life, Look, the Saturday Evening Post. The articles weren't even classified. They openly discussed production numbers, factory outputs, shipbuilding rates. The information was public because America didn't fear anyone knowing. One article featured a Ford plant in Michigan. The factory produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, one bomber every hour from one factory. The article mentioned that Ford operated several such plants. Takeshi calculated, assuming 8-hour shifts, that was nearly 10 bombers daily from one facility. Japan's entire aircraft industry couldn't match that. Another magazine showed photographs of American farms, tractors harvesting wheat, mechanical combines processing grain. One Iowa farm produced enough wheat to feed 1,000 people for a year. The farmer in the photograph was smiling, prosperous, well-fed. Takeshi's father had worked rice paddies by hand his entire life. In a good year, their farm might produce enough to feed 30 people after the Army took its share. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. The accumulation begins. December arrived. Winter in Wisconsin was brutal, colder than anything Takeshi had experienced, but the barracks had heat, real heat, from radiators connected to a central boiler. The prisoners received wool blankets, winter coats, gloves. On Attu, Japanese soldiers had frozen to death in their summer uniforms. Here, prisoners stayed warm. Christmas brought another shock. The camp commander arranged a special meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, confused and suspicious. Why would the enemy celebrate with them? An American chaplain explained through a translator, "In America, we believe even enemies deserve basic dignity. You're prisoners, but you're also men. Today is about remembering that." Sergeant Kobayashi had written a letter that night. Takeshi saw him struggling with the words, crossing out sentences, starting over. Finally, he'd asked Takeshi to read it. "Dear wife," it began, "I am well. The Americans feed us 3 times daily. Real meat, real rice sometimes. We have beds and blankets. We are not beaten or starved. I do not understand this. Our commander said Americans were barbaric, that they would torture prisoners. Instead, they treat us better than our own officers did. I feel shame writing this, but it is true. Please tell no one." The letter would never be sent. Camp policy allowed letters home, but they were censored, and Kobayashi feared what the Kempe Tai might do to his family if they knew what he'd written. So he kept it, hidden under his mattress, a private confession of cognitive collapse. January 1945 brought newspapers. The camp received them regularly, and English-speaking prisoners translated articles. The news was grim for Japan. The Philippines were falling. American B-29s were bombing Tokyo. The submarine blockade had effectively cut off Japan's oil supply, but it was the smaller articles that struck hardest. Advertisements for cars, for washing machines, for luxury goods. Even during total war, American civilians had access to products that Japanese elites couldn't obtain. One advertisement showed a woman in a kitchen surrounded by electric appliances, a refrigerator, a mixer, a toaster. The ad promised these items would be available again after the war, implying they'd been common before. Private Tanaka stared at the advertisement for a long time. "My mother cooked over a charcoal brazier her entire life," he said quietly. "She drew water from a well. She washed clothes by hand in the river. And this is what American housewives consider normal." The gap wasn't just military, it was civilizational. In February, a new group of prisoners arrived from Iwo Jima. They looked like ghosts, skeletal, exhausted, many with untreated wounds. The camp medics rushed them to the infirmary. Within 2 weeks, those same men were gaining weight, recovering, looking human again. Takeshi spoke with one of them, a corporal named Ichiro Suzuki, who'd survived the initial invasion. "The bombardment lasted 3 days, Suzuki said, his voice still hollow with shock. 3 days of constant shelling. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, hundreds of ships. The bombs fell like rain. Then the Marines landed, and behind them came tanks, flamethrowers, artillery. We fought hard. We died in our positions. But they just kept coming. More men, more equipment, more ammunition. For every American we killed, 3 more appeared. We ran out of bullets. They never did." He paused, drinking the coffee that had become routine. One of our officers said we were defeating America, that their casualties were unbearable, that they'd negotiate peace. But the Americans kept attacking. They didn't care about casualties. They had so many men, so much equipment, they could afford the losses. We couldn't. The mathematics of attrition had become clear. Japan was losing because it had already lost. The outcome had been determined not by spirit or courage, but by industrial capacity and resources. A nation that could feed 400,000 prisoners lavishly while fielding 10 million soldiers and producing goods for civilian consumption had won before the first shot was fired. Letters from home. March brought another blow. Camp authorities announced that prisoners could receive mail from Japan. The letters came through neutral Switzerland, carefully censored, often months old. But they came. Takeshi's letter arrived on a Tuesday. His younger sister had written it. His father was dead, killed in an American air raid on Kumamoto. His mother was alive but struggling. The rice ration had been cut again. People were eating sweet potato vines and acorns. His sister worked in a factory making uniform buttons. She received 1 small rice ball per day for her labor. "We are told that victory is near," she wrote, "that America is weakening, that the special attack forces are turning the tide. But brother, I am so hungry. Everyone is hungry. The city is in ruins. There is no medicine. When people get sick, they die. They just die. No one can help. I pray you are safe, wherever you are. I pray the war ends soon. I don't care who wins anymore. I just want to eat." Takeshi read the letter 3 times. Then he went to the latrine and vomited up his lunch. Fresh chicken, rice, vegetables, milk. He knelt on the cold tile floor, forehead pressed against the porcelain, and cried. The same scene played out across the camp. Prisoners receiving letters from home, learning about the starvation, the bombing, the desperation, then going to the mess hall that evening for pork chops and mashed potatoes. The guilt was unbearable. The irony was crushing. They, the defeated, ate better than their families, their countrymen, their soldiers still fighting. The enemy showed more mercy to prisoners than the Japanese government showed to its own people. Sergeant Kobayashi summed it up one night. "We were told that Japanese spirit would overcome American material, that our discipline would defeat their softness. But what if we had it backwards? What if their abundance isn't a weakness? What if being able to feed your people, your soldiers, your prisoners, what if that's the strength we never understood?" No one answered. The question was too large, too dangerous, too obviously true. The breaking point, April 12, 1945. President Roosevelt died. The camp commander announced it at morning formation, his voice solemn. That evening, the American guards looked subdued, grieving for their leader. The prisoners expected celebration. They'd been taught that Roosevelt was the architect of their suffering, the devil who'd forced war upon Japan. His death should have been good news. Instead, Takeshi felt nothing. No joy, no satisfaction, just a dull realization that one man's death changed nothing about the fundamental reality they'd all come to understand. America would continue, the war would continue, the bombing would continue, and Japan would lose because it had never had a chance to win. 3 days later, something happened that completed Takeshi's transformation. A young American guard, Private First Class Davis, had befriended some of the prisoners. He was 19 from Iowa, a farm boy who'd volunteered after Pearl Harbor. He practiced his broken Japanese with them. They taught him how to write his name in kanji. He shared cigarettes and told stories about growing up in the Midwest. That morning, Davis brought photographs from home. His farm. His family. His mother standing in front of a 2-story house. His father beside a new truck. His sisters in dresses that looked clean and well-made. Cattle grazing in fields that stretched to the horizon. "My dad's worried about me," Davis said through the translator. "But I told him not to be. The war's almost over. We'll win soon, and I'll come home." There was no malice in his voice, no hatred, just simple confidence in inevitable victory and the certainty that he'd survive to see it. Takeshi looked at the photograph of Davis's farm, the prosperity, the peace, the abundance. This was what America looked like before the war. This was normal for them. They hadn't mobilized their full strength until attacked. They hadn't sacrificed everything for military expansion. They'd simply been living, farming, building, growing, And when forced to fight, they'd revealed what prosperity could produce when directed toward war. They'd revealed that abundance wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of overwhelming power. "Your family farm is bigger than my entire village," Takeshi said quietly. Davis shrugged. "It's just a regular farm, nothing special. There's thousands like it." Thousands. Of course there were. America had everything: space, resources, people, industry. They had it all, and they'd barely noticed the war's impact on civilian life. Meanwhile, Japan had stripped everything, sacrificed everything, and still couldn't match even a fraction of American production. That night, Takeshi couldn't eat dinner. He sat in the mess hall, staring at the food, understanding finally and completely that everything he'd believed was a lie. Not just wrong, a deliberate lie told to millions of people to make them fight a war they could never win. Japanese spirit hadn't been defeated, it had been irrelevant. You couldn't beat industrial capacity with willpower. You couldn't overcome abundance with discipline. The war had been lost before it began, and every death, every sacrifice, every hungry child in Japan had been pointless. He pushed his tray away. Sergeant Kobayashi sat down across from him. "You understand now," Kobayashi said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "What they told us was all lies." "Yes." "We never had a chance." "No." They sat in silence for a long moment. Around them, other prisoners ate their dinner, each man processing his own version of the same revelation. "The food isn't a reward," Takeshi said finally. "It's not even kindness. It's just normal for them. They feed us like this because they can, because it doesn't even strain them. We're just 3,000 more mouths, and they don't even notice." "The most terrifying thing," Kobayashi added, "is that they're fighting two wars. Two, Europe and the Pacific. And we're the secondary theater. We're not even their main concern. They're beating us with their surplus capacity." The truth settled over them like snow. Silent, cold, undeniable. Victory in ashes, May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news spread through the camp within hours. Some American guards celebrated. Others simply looked relieved. For the Japanese prisoners, it meant something else. Now America could focus entirely on the Pacific. All that industrial might, all those soldiers, all that equipment, no longer divided. The end was inevitable. The only question was how many more would die before Japan accepted reality. 3 months later, the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. The camp commander called the prisoners together and explained what had happened. New weapons, unimaginable power, cities destroyed in single blasts. Some prisoners refused to believe it. It had to be propaganda. No weapon could be that powerful. But Takeshi believed it. Why wouldn't it be true? America had demonstrated impossible capacity in every other domain. Why not this? A nation that could feed millions, produce thousands of planes and ships and tanks, fight two wars simultaneously. Why couldn't they also split atoms and harness the sun's power? August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's radio address. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The camp fell silent. Men who'd believed surrender was impossible, who'd been taught that death was preferable to capture, heard their divine emperor admit defeat. Some wept. Others simply stared into space. Their entire worldview collapsed. Takeshi felt only exhaustion and relief. It was over. Finally over. No more death. No more pointless sacrifice. The lie had ended. The long road home repatriation took time, months. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the Pacific required planning, ships, organization. The prisoners waited. During those months, Takeshi attended classes. The Americans offered educational programs, English lessons, trade skills, democratic principles. Some prisoners refused, clinging to old beliefs. Others, like Takeshi, attended because what else was there? The old certainties were gone. Perhaps learning something new might help in whatever came next. The teacher was a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American who spoke both languages fluently. Lieutenant Yamashita had fought in Italy with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He told stories of Japanese Americans proving their loyalty while their families were interned. He explained democracy, civil rights, freedom of speech, concepts that seemed alien and impossibly idealistic. "Japan will change," Lieutenant Yamashita said one day. The occupation will enforce reforms, democracy, women's rights, land redistribution. It will be difficult, but America doesn't want revenge. They want Japan to become prosperous and peaceful. A trading partner eventually, not an enemy. The idea seemed absurd. The victors would help rebuild the defeated? Why? Because, Yamashita explained, stability is good for everyone. A prosperous Japan is better for America than a desperate, angry Japan. They learned from the mistakes made after the Great War. They want a lasting peace, not temporary victory. Takeshi struggled to process this. Everything he'd learned about warfare suggested the victor destroyed the defeated. But America had different rules. They played a longer game. They thought in terms of decades, not years. Just another demonstration of their overwhelming capacity. They could afford to be generous. Finally, in March 1946, Takeshi's turn came. He boarded a Liberty ship at San Francisco, the same harbor where he'd first glimpsed America's might. The ship was crowded with returning prisoners, all silent, all nervous about what they'd find at home. The voyage took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of regular meals, clean water, medical care. Even in defeat, even going home, they were treated better than they'd been treated as soldiers of the victorious Japanese Empire. The irony had become routine. Homecoming. The ship docked at Yokohama. What had once been Japan's second-largest port was now a field of rubble. Takeshi stood on deck, staring at the devastation. Buildings collapsed, streets torn up, the harbor barely functional. Everywhere, the evidence of industrial bombing, the systematic destruction of a nation that had challenged a power beyond its capacity to defeat. Processing took 3 days. American officials checked papers, conducted interviews, cleared prisoners for release. Japanese officials looked uncomfortable, defeated, shuffling papers with the inefficiency of a broken system. Finally, Takeshi was free. Free to return to Kumamoto. Free to face whatever remained. The train system still functioned, though barely. The journey that had taken 8 hours before the war now took 2 days. Takeshi shared a crowded car with other returnees, plus civilians traveling to find family, displaced persons searching for homes that no longer existed. Everyone looked thin. Everyone looked tired. No one looked victorious. Kumamoto had been bombed 3 times. The city center was gone. The castle stood damaged but recognizable. His neighborhood had survived mostly intact, though several houses showed fire damage. His mother's house still stood. Takeshi approached slowly, afraid and hopeful. He knocked, waited, knocked again. His sister opened the door. She'd lost weight, at least 20 pounds from her already slight frame. She stared at him for a long moment, then burst into tears. "Takeshi, you're alive. You're fat." He wasn't fat. He'd actually lost weight during repatriation as rations decreased. But compared to his family, compared to everyone in Japan, he looked healthy, well-fed. The evidence of American captivity was written on his body. His mother emerged from inside, 60 years old but looking 80, thin, gray, worn down by years of war and starvation. She embraced him, weeping. That night, they shared what food they had: rice mixed with barley and sweet potato, a small piece of fish, tea made from roasted wheat, a meal his family prepared with pride, using their full ration. It was less than what he'd eaten for breakfast on any given day at Camp McCoy. Takeshi said nothing. What could he say? That the enemy had fed him better than his own country could? That he'd gained weight while his family starved? That America's mercy toward prisoners exceeded Japan's care for its own people? He ate his family's meager dinner in silence, shame mixing with grief, gratitude mixing with guilt. The contradictions would never fully resolve. The long memory. 23 years later, in 1968, Takeshi stood in his small apartment in Tokyo. He worked as a translator now, helping American businessmen navigate Japanese markets. The irony wasn't lost on him. The enemy he'd once tried to kill now paid his salary. Japan had transformed. The occupation had ended in 1952. Democracy had taken root, however imperfectly. The economy was growing rapidly. The same industrial capacity that had been lacking during the war was now directed toward electronics, automobiles, consumer goods. Japan was becoming prosperous, and America had helped. The Marshall Plan's Asian equivalent: investment, technology transfer, open markets. The victor had indeed rebuilt the defeated, just as Lieutenant Yamashita had predicted. An American businessman, Mr. Henderson, had asked about Takeshi's war experience. "Were you a soldier?" "Yes, I was captured on Saipan, spent the rest of the war in Wisconsin." "Wisconsin? That must have been cold." "It was, but I was warm, well-fed, better treated than I'd been in the Japanese army." Henderson had looked surprised. "Really? I mean, I'm glad, but I didn't realize." "Most people don't." Takeshi poured tea. Real tea now, not burnt wheat. "The Americans fed us 3 meals a day. Meat, vegetables, bread, coffee. More food than most Japanese soldiers ever saw. More food than my family had during the entire war." "That must have been strange." "Strange?" "Yes. Strange to learn that everything you believed was a lie. Strange to discover that your enemy's prisoners ate better than your people. Strange to realize that abundance wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate strength." "It taught me something important," Takeshi said. "We were told that American prosperity made them soft, that they couldn't endure hardship. That Japanese spirit would overcome their material advantages, but we had it exactly backwards. The ability to maintain prosperity, to feed your people and your enemies simultaneously, to fight a war while citizens lived comfortably, that was the real strength. We confused poverty with virtue and called abundance weakness. It cost us everything." Henderson sipped his tea thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way. Most Americans don't have to. That's the point. You demonstrated power through casual generosity, not through brutality. You proved your strength by being able to afford mercy. It was the most devastating propaganda defeat possible." Years later, in a 1985 interview for a documentary about the Pacific War, Takeshi would elaborate. He was 65 then, gray-haired, successful, comfortable. The interviewer asked about the moment he realized Japan would lose. "The first meal," Takeshi said. "Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, September 1944. Fresh bread and butter, real beef, coffee. I stared at that food, and I knew. Not consciously. I wasn't ready to admit it yet. But somewhere deep inside, I understood. A nation that could feed prisoners like this, while fighting 2 wars, while their civilians lived in prosperity, that nation was unbeatable. Not because of their weapons or their soldiers, but because of their sheer capacity. They had everything. We had nothing. And we'd convinced ourselves that having nothing made us stronger. Do you resent it? That they treated you so well?" Takeshi smiled slightly. "How can I resent kindness? How can I resent being fed when I was hungry, given medical care when I was sick, treated humanely when I expected cruelty? No, I'm grateful. But the gratitude comes with understanding how devastating it was. They defeated us not just militarily, but ideologically. They proved that their system, the democracy, the free markets, the individual liberty, produced more, produced abundance. And abundance, properly directed, creates overwhelming power. What did you think about American food afterward?" The old man laughed softly. "I've eaten American food many times since. McDonald's, KFC. The irony is rich, isn't it? The Japanese used to mock American food culture. Now we import it eagerly. We lost the war, but we gained prosperity. And we learned that there's no shame in abundance. No weakness in treating people, even enemies, with basic dignity. That first meal in Wisconsin taught me more about power than 3 years of combat ever did." The echo of bread. Takeshi Yamamoto died in 1997 at 77 in a comfortable Tokyo hospital. His children and grandchildren were prosperous, educated, living in a Japan that would have been unrecognizable to the soldier who'd fought at Guadalcanal. Among his possessions, his daughter found a journal he'd kept for 50 years. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1944. "Today I ate real bread for the first time in 2 years. The Americans fed us like they cared whether we lived. Everything we were told was a lie. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I believe. But I know this. A nation that can afford to be generous to its enemies is a nation that's already won." The subsequent entries tracked his gradual acceptance of reality, his growing understanding of the gap between propaganda and truth, his eventual embrace of the very system he'd once tried to destroy. The final entry, written 2 weeks before his death, read, "I tell my grandchildren about the war, about the hunger, about the fighting, about the fear, But most of all, I tell them about the bread, because the bread was when I learned that strength isn't just the ability to endure suffering, it's the capacity to end it. Japan has learned this lesson. We're prosperous now because we embraced abundance instead of glorifying scarcity. The Americans showed us the way, ironically, through their kindness to prisoners. That first meal in Wisconsin changed my life more than any battle. It showed me what power really looks like. Not cruelty, not dominance, but the simple, devastating demonstration of prosperity, the ability to feed your enemies while defeating them. That's strength. Everything else is pretense. The story of Japanese POWs and American food is really a story about the collision between ideology and reality, between what nations tell themselves and what actually exists, between the myths we create to justify our actions and the truths that eventually emerge. For thousands of Japanese prisoners, a simple meal became the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. Not because it won their loyalty immediately, but because it introduced an undeniable question. If everything we were told about American weakness was a lie, what else were we lied to about? The answer to that question transformed not just individual prisoners, but eventually helped reshape an entire nation. Post-war Japan's embrace of democracy and free markets wasn't just imposed by occupation, it was enabled by the thousands of returned soldiers who'd seen, firsthand, what prosperity could produce. They'd mocked American food. They'd called Americans weak for needing comfort. They'd believed spirit would overcome material. Then they'd eaten in American camps. And they'd learned that abundance wasn't a weakness to be mocked. It was a strength they'd never understood. A strength that had won the war before the first shot was fired. The bread and coffee served at Camp McCoy did more to defeat Japanese militarism than any bomb or bullet, because they proved, undeniably and personally, that everything the propaganda had taught was backwards. And once that foundation cracked, everything built upon it collapsed. Takeshi Yamamoto never forgot that first meal. Decades later, successful and comfortable, he would still remember the smell of fresh bread, the taste of real coffee, the moment when mockery died and understanding began. I was wrong about everything, he told his grandchildren, but I was most wrong about what makes a nation strong. I thought it was the ability to suffer. It was actually the ability to thrive. The Americans taught me that, with butter and beef and bread, with abundance I couldn't even imagine. That was their greatest weapon, and we never saw it coming.